Welcome to Pop Culture Pod, your place for all things culture and society. I'm your host, Diamante. Today, we'll be talking about role-playing games and representation in relation to gender and race. The episode will cover the issues found in RPGs and ultimately what is to be done to create a better and safer place for minorities. This is a broad topic, so I'll start off by defining a key term. Role-playing games are games where a player plays a character that is often different from themselves. This can be in a variety of games, from a cyberpunk combat-oriented video game to a high fantasy paper and pen tabletop game. In these games, people can be characters that are completely different from themselves. People can play different genders, races, and species. And with this, we've reached the first topic of the main source of this episode. Aaron Trammell's 2018 essay, Representation and Discrimination in Role-Playing Games, opens by citing Lisa Nakamura's 1995 essay, Race In for Cyberspace. In Nakamura's essay, she coins the term identity tourism. Others have created terms like identity traveling or computer cross-dressing. Essentially, what these terms boil down to is that a person is playing a different identity from their own and then exploring the other from the safety of being behind a screen or a character. Nakamura uses an example of this from a game Lambda Mu, which was an early online dungeon video game. She talks about how the game had a large white male user base who often played Asian characters who were comedically stereotypical. The players would choose usernames that were considered offensive, like Miss_Saigon and Maiden Taiwan. While I love Broadway and puns as much as the next guy, these usernames and avatars created a space that was alienating to Asian folks. And while inclusion, here are the heavy air quotes, like this, can be alienating, on the other side of it, excluding race or ethnicity altogether can also be alienating. Higgins' article, Blackless Fantasy, talks about games attempting to erase race from the conversations in games. They point to the 1999 game EverQuest, which in their character creation, instead of providing a range of skin tones for the human characters, decided to make humans an all-white race. To make up for the lack of skin tones, they made a black humanoid species called Erudites. While the species themselves are not technically racist, with the species not conforming to ancient black stereotypes, by being actually known for their intelligence, there are other ways that the species alienates black players. For one, the race Erudites are physically isolated on the game's map. Whereas all the other races are found on the two main continents, the Erudites are sequestered to a completely separate continent. The physical isolation of the Erudites make them less appealing to play, and in turn isolates black players who might want an avatar that sorta looks like them. Second, the lack of skin tone diversity in the human characters speaks to the broader idea that whiteness is the default, and anything else is inhuman. The harmful ideas of the, quote, default human can extend to gender as well. In gaming spaces, women are seen as the other and are often either hypersexualized or hated. Trammell speaks on the issue of female characters in Dungeons & Dragons. Back in the 70s, many key voices in the Dungeons & Dragons community proposed ways to include women by changing character stats. In Misogyny in the Female Body in Dungeons & Dragons, Trammell provides a chart that was made by Len Lakofka, who is a prominent voice in the community and friends with the game's creator, Gary Gygax. Lakofka described this new trait called beauty for female characters, which would be set to replace the stat charisma. In the chart provided, it breaks it down with female species, elf, women, which are female humans, hobbit, orc, and dwarves. It then shows the role that men would need to save or succeed against the women's attempt to seduce them. while involving a plethora of problematic aspects, like implying that intrinsically elves are more attractive than dwarves and orcs, which both species have traits that are often based in anti-Semitic and racist tropes, which we'll be talking about the history of that later, there is a wider implication that the only power women hold is in their looks. The alienation of minorities within the game have a very real-world effect on the demographics of players. At Gen Con, the world's largest tabletop role-playing game convention in 2011, only about 6% of the featured speakers were women. While Gen Con has improved somewhat in more recent years, the larger industry is much slower to change. At game developing companies, there's been a serious issue with sexism, and many of the female employees have spoken up about it. Like women in many other fields, they're evaluated harsher, passed over for recognition and praise, and silenced over the issues that they face. Because of this, games are more often developed by solely a white male team, and as a result, they make games with only a white male perspective. These homogenous teams result in games that have things like the Erudites or a beauty skill, which furthers the cycle of alienating women and people of color in the industry and community. But where do many of these ideas about race and gender and fantasy even come from? While obviously the sexism and racism are indicative of a larger societal problem, there is one specific author where much of modern fantasy claim their inspiration is from: J.R.R. Tolkien and his series Lord of the Rings. While respected in his own right, Tolkien was also very much a product of his time. With his focus on Western mythology, things like elves, dwarves, and four-legged dragons have become the default. By extension, white people have also become the default in fantasy. Tolkien describes his elves as blonde, pale, and most importantly, good. In contrast, orcs are really the only dark-skinned species, and they're described as having dreads, being ugly, and possessing evil. Similarly, dwarves play into anti-Semitic tropes by being grubby, with large noses, and an obsession with gold. While problematic in its own right, these tropes have essentially become inseparable from fantasy today. In modern fantasy, elves are always white and beautiful, orcs are always black and evil, and dwarves are always hook-nosed and greedy. In recent years, creators and fans alike have tried to separate role-playing games from their problematic past. Some ways have been like removing race-based modifiers to skills, desexualizing the outfits worn by female characters, and having a greater diversity in the range of characters that people are able to play and interact with. While these are all a great step in the right direction, ultimately the best way to work on this issue is having a more diverse staff behind the scenes. Having more perspectives is the simplest way to avoid issues that homogenous teams frequently run into. Higgin's article speaks on the issue best, saying, "Their bodies become written by other texts, yet they remain powerless to speak for themselves." And with that, the podcast comes to an end. I highly recommend reading the sources used for yourself, as they have even more information on this topic. They'll be listed at the end as well as linked below, along with some other sources I found interesting related to the topic. Thank you so much for listening. I've been your host, Diamante, and this has been Pop Culture Pod. Stay curious, stay educated. Bye! The sources used for this episode are in alphabetical order: Tanner Higgins' Blackless Fantasy, Emma Westcott's Playing with Gender, Anderson Rearick III's Why is the Only Good Orc a Dead Orc, Aaron Trammell's Misogyny and the Female Body in Dungeons & Dragons, as well as his article Representation and Discrimination in Role-Playing Games.